Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. Listeners, it's been some time since I read a good fantasy novel involving vampires. So when I heard about Tigest Girma's debut novel, Immortal Dark, published by Hachette Australia, I was intrigued and more than a little excited. Tigest is an Ethiopian writer based in Melbourne. She holds a Bachelor of Education and splits her time between writing and teaching. As is evident from the cast of incredible characters in this book, Tigest is passionate about exploring East African stories and myths, weaving them with dark and fantastical themes. Immortal Dark as a debut is remarkable. Reimagining a tale as old as time with a fresh, rich and clever perspective, Tigest's book heralds a new and exciting era of vampire fiction. But more than that, listeners, 1 week after its publication, Immortal Dark went to the top of the New York Times Young Adult Hardcover Bestseller list. So for me, it's Twilight meets an older Harry Potter meets a discovery of witches, an utterly delightful and compulsive read. And I'm thrilled to welcome Tigest to the podcast today. Hi, Tigest.
Hello, what a lovely introduction. Thank you for that. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be talking to you. Now, what an incredible run you've had with this book. Congratulations. Such
Thank you.
well-deserved success for a remarkable book. How are you feeling?
Oh, I have been on cloud nine ever since this book came out, which was in September, I believe. And every week since then has been quite surprising because I get, comments from readers all over reading it and reacting to it. And like you said, it hit the list, which I didn't expect it to. So it's been a journey. It's been everything I've wanted and more in a way. So I'm very thankful and grateful to be in this space now.
Oh, that's amazing. So, Tigist, when you started thinking about writing a vampire novel, was this what you imagined or indeed hoped for yourself?
That's a very interesting question. I think at the beginning, I had no idea what the outcome would look like. The concept of Black vampires just intrigued me so much that I knew there was a story there. And I had no idea how I was going to get there because I'd just come off multiple rejections from my other projects. And now I had this scary idea about, taking vampires, which everyone really loves, and breathing a new myth into them or a new life into them. And I was very nervous at the beginning, but I just had this pull or instinct inside me that said, if I stuck with this idea, something great would come out of it. So that's what I did for like 2 years. I stuck with it, and here we are.
Indeed, absolutely. Your gamble, so to speak, paid off well and
Mm,
truly with this one.
yes.
And so, what has it meant to you to see it resonate so well with so many?
Oh, it's been everything. Because my fear when I started this journey, writing journey, is I was always afraid would there be space for Black fantasy? Because it's been, normally the spaces fantasy occupies is, we see white characters front and center, and that's what I grew up reading and loving. So I was quite afraid when I decided to make it an entirely Black cast. So I was like, how would people react to this? That was always a worry in the back of my head. Are we ready for publishing to be more diverse? That's always a question I ask myself. So I looked to previous great Black authors like Tomi Adeyemi and Tracy Dion, who have done amazing in the YA genre specifically for Black fantasy. So I was like, if they can do it, maybe I can. So I always looked to them as like mentors, far away mentors, and yeah, I just followed what they would do. I just, kept going at it. I never changed my story. I didn't want to change it in some way just to appease some sort of, the wider audience. I stuck with it. I wrote for the Black girls mainly. That's who I will always write for. And everyone seems to love it, which, I'm grateful for.
Yeah, I mean, love it is probably an understatement for me. As you said earlier, it really breathed new life into a story that we've heard before, and you just brought such an incredibly rich and nuanced perspective to this story that I mean I cannot recommend it highly enough. So tell me, Tigist, how did it all start?
Well, it started with Twilight, watching Twilight. Of course it did. Because that's, I grew up with that. It marked my teen years.
Yeah.
Every time I wanted to escape from this world, I would go pick up a paranormal romance book. And that's always been in the back of my head. My first true love was fantasy, where a girl had to go through trials and she would fall in love and she would have powers. That was always what story was for me. So that's always been in the back of my head until, the pandemic hit and I was rewatching my favorite shows, so like Twilight or movies. And an idea popped into my head. I was like, what if vampires could originate from Africa? I love vampires as they are now, but I feel like there's more work to be, done here to reimagine. And I pulled out my notes app quickly on my phone and I typed in, okay, Black vampires, and there's only specific families they could feed from. And instantly that concept was so intriguing to me. I was like, okay, why can, vampires feed on specific bloodlines? Why not everyone? And I think I know I found a really good story when I keep asking why, and I want to go back and explore it more and more. So that was the very beginning of everything.
Oh, just fantastic. Now, you mentioned Twilight, and for me, I mean, Twilight was my first foray into vampire fiction, at least since reading Bram Stoker's Dracula many years
Hmm.
beforehand. And
Hmm.
apart from the handful of characters of color in the Twilight series, the phenomenon
Yes.
has largely, as you kind of rightly pointed out, has largely been whitewashed. How important a factor was that in your decision to write Immortal Dark?
Hmm. It was a big one. It was a big one. Because, like I told you, I just spent so much of my teenage years reading these amazing paranormal romances where I've just never seen a person of color. And
Mm.
if I have, it was a best friend that popped up once and disappeared. And I was like, and a perfect example of this is Bonnie from the Vampire Diaries show, which I really loved I still do actually. I was gonna say as a teen, I'm still in love with that show. But whenever she popped on the screen, I would be engaged fully. I would be like, okay, I want to see her story, and then she would disappear, and I would feel this sense of loss. I want more of that. So if I'm ever going to create a fantasy world, I felt like I had a responsibility to myself and to readers to really explore my own culture first, my own people first, instead of other ethnicities. Because when I was starting out, when I was 15 or starting out, I used to write about white characters only because that was all I consumed. And I would look back at my work then, I was like, what are you thinking there? What's going on? Because you don't know anything. You have nothing in common with these people though, because you've consumed so much of their content, you think you do. So I think in a lot of ways, writing Immortal Dark was reconnecting with my own culture and history as well, because I've been quite distant from it. Because I did grow up in Ethiopia and I moved to Australia. So I was like, what else can I find out about my own history and culture? And how can I weave that in the fantasy world?
Yes, so insightful of you, Tigist, because I think that it is so true that we consume so much of our reading and movies, and all of which mostly up until very recently are populated by white characters. And I think when
Yes,
we do imagine our own creativity, it is unfortunately filled with those same very characters. And
for
I think
sure.
it is so interesting to me to hear you say that you reconnected with your own culture by
Mhm.
writing this novel. And I think what has eventuated is something truly special.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was my hope, and it worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for listeners who haven't yet read this story yet, Tigist, can you tell me more about it?
Okay. So I say Immortal Dark is Black vampires meets dark academia because it takes place in a haunting university setting where students have to study an arcane philosophy in order to inherit their family's vampires. So our main character and her sister grew up very far away from the society until her sister is eventually kidnapped by one of the vampires there. So Kidan, our character, has to go back to the university to try and find her and kill anyone who gets in her way. She's a very dark character. I love her. And she goes there to bring her sister from wherever she's hiding and live with the accused vampire. I think a lot of the tension comes from that point, which I really loved adding. They're forced to live in one house because in this world, houses are very powerful things to inherit. And she falls into this competition with him to inherit her legacy and house. And he wants that for himself as well. And, where is her sister? That is the main question of this novel.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Forced proximity creates a
Hmm.
lot of tension in this book, and a lot of the romantic tension, I would have to say, in this book
Hmm.
as well.
Which I love too.
Oh, Absolutely. It was just sensational. It's the thing that keeps you turning the pages because
Hmm.
you want to know what's going to happen. Tigist, the world building in this book is
Hmm.
something to behold. Like all fantasy novels, world building is incredibly important to the reader's immersive experience. But the world of Euxley is extraordinary. Its physical layout, the laws, the customs are detailed and intricate and nuanced. And I mentioned at the beginning, Immortal Dark reminded me of Deborah Harkness's A Discovery of Witches, which is set in Oxford University in England. But with Immortal Dark, Euxley is a fictional world unlike
Hmm.
any other. So tell me how someone goes about building this microcosm of society in their head.
Mm. It's funny because when I set the story in the contemporary world, which is our world, I was tricking myself into thinking I don't have to do a lot of world building because it's already here. And, I get intimidated by high fantasy books because, you have to come up with everything from scratch. So I was like, no, I don't have to do that. I'm going to set it in my world. But then it turned out once I got to the university, suddenly I was coming up with my own philosophy. And I was coming up with specific cultures influenced, specific areas in the university influenced by Ethiopian culture. So I have places from Ethiopia mentioned in the book, and Amharic language, which is the Ethiopian native language, mentioned. So suddenly became my own in a way. And I drew inspiration from, of course, just the greats that I've seen, the Dark Academia books like Ninth House by Ria Bardugo, which does Dark Academia really well, and The Secret History as well by Donna Tartt. All of these haunting, atmospheric, gothic places would just, I feel like there was something alluring about them. So I wanted to infuse that to UCSA University. But I think, and when it came down to it in the end, I always had to go back to the character, which was Kidan, and I wanted to shape this world around her. How would it challenge her and how would it push her to change? Because Kidan is a very twisted, dark character at the beginning, and she believes she's quite evil, like she's the most evil thing to exist until she goes to this university where vampires exist. And there's laws, but they're quite corruptive laws, sort of. And there's this philosophy where she has to study that's all about facing your inner darkness. So I use those things to shape the university and how the different courses would apply to her and at each stage. So I really used her inner journey to sort of build the world around her.
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly fascinating to me how somebody like, plans all of this in their head. But having said that, is there any particular kind of planning that you would do or anything
Mm,
that you would have in mind when you thought about Euxley?
I wish I did. I wish I am so much a discovery writer that it is horrible because it takes me a lot of time and rewrites, I should say. I rewrite a lot because I get these glimpses of images, like a scene of her arriving at the university by a garden. That the first time she meets the vampires by a garden, and that just drops into my head out of nowhere. So
Mm.
suddenly, okay, this university has a garden. And then I needed to key down to learn a specific lesson. So suddenly this philosophy has this education inside of it that she has to unpack and learn. So it is glimpses of images. I don't really sit down and say, okay, I want these four towers here and I want this university to have this, that. It really is glimpses of images that I just follow and hopefully tie together in the end. And I have wonderful editors that help me with questions that are like, why is this here? And I'm like, okay, I have to explain why is that there. So I don't know if that's the most helpful way to world build, but that's how my brain works. Because if I sit down and restrict myself into specifically building each aspect of the world, I would be so bored. So I just go with my characters and how, they would see the world around them.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, so Kidana Dani, the slightly terrifying female protagonist in this book, is everything we don't expect in a novel like this. And if we were to think about Bella, for example, in Twilight, who was limpid and frustratingly helpless on so many levels. And incidentally, I think we need a whole podcast episode on its own to talk about Bella. Now, Kadan is frighteningly empowered. She's restricted by the rules of this old society. She finds ways to subvert and question to get what she wants and what she needs. So tell me about your inspiration for Kidan.
My inspiration for Kidan, it came about because, like you said, I read a lot of Bella Swan and Elena Gilbert from The Vampire Diaries, and I loved those characters. They did what they were
Mm.
supposed to do. They pulled us into the vampiric world, but I had seen a lot of them. Like I've seen the very quiet, shy girl, being seen by the vampire, and then, she's very demure, she's very gentle, and I love gentle girls. I love those type of leads and characters, but I wanted to do something different with Kidan, like you said. And I think actually in the very original draft of Kidan's story, she was quite tame. She was not a killer because in this in this draft, in this final version, she's actually murdered someone and she has blood on her hands. But originally she didn't. And I think, like I told you, it was me sort of just copying whatever I would see. I would be writing white characters, I would be writing similar types of stories as white authors would write. So I was really comfortable with that version of her. She was safe. But then I was bored reading it. So I was like, okay, Kidan, you need to do something interesting. Like, what is something unique about you that I could really tap into? So I scratched out that first draft. That it was a couple chapters of it. And I went on a blank page and I wrote down, what type of characters interest me. And it was the morally corrupt characters that really pulled me in. So I'm like, I'm going to make you sort of dangerous. And I'm going to make you the type of character that not everyone will quite like. You're not here to be liked. You're here to do your job, sort of thing. Although I love Kidan, I'm biased, but I love her. And a lot of characters within the story sort of follow that line. They're very morally corrupt. So that was just what I would always go and, try to do. Just corrupt characters would pull me in more than the innocent sort of characters. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay, so talking about another morally corrupt character,
Mhm.
Sisenius Sagad. He is one utterly terrifying, complex, and
Mhm.
sexy as hell vampire.
Yes, I would say so.
Tell me about your inspiration for him.
Oh, my inspiration for him. Like I told you, I'm a romantic. I love reading romance between like very unlikely sort of couples as well. So Edward and Bella, Damon and Elena from The Vampire Diaries, just these brooding male characters always would be interesting to me. But again, I've never seen them fall for the black girl. So
Mm.
I was gonna obviously make him do that. And I also wanted to push I wanted to see how far I could push being morally gray with him because I feel like he's almost morally black. He's just the worst version of Kida. So I was like, okay, what would happen if you put a very, sad girl who thinks she's evil with a immortal who is quite content with his darkness and wants to live forever, whereas, Kidan thinks she's so evil that she doesn't deserve to live in this world. So their dynamic became quite interesting, I think immediately because it was a push and pull. He's so
Yes.
comfortable in his skin and she doesn't like that. Why would he be comfortable with what he's done? Whereas she's, trying to save the world in a way by taking herself out of it. So I think for
Mm.
a good romance, you need those sort of opposite dynamics.
Yeah, push pull, I think, is an excellent way of describing their relationship, right through this novel. She's sort of questioning her place in the world and also trying to save her sister,
Mhm.
obviously that's the main part of the story. So yeah, that dynamic is incredible. So, Tigist, you draw on your Ethiopian heritage to give authenticity and richness to the Euxley world,
Mhm.
particularly in relation to the artifacts and the history of the Euxley houses. Was that an important part of writing this book for you?
Oh yeah, that came about quite naturally as I was just writing Susenyos's past. I was like, he's obviously an Ethiopian character. So with that, and he's lived a long life, what has he seen? What is he interested in? And his history sort of became a point of interest for me because if he's Ethiopian and it's in Ethiopian history, what could he treasure? What kind of artifacts would he hold dear? And it became this chance to comment on how, artifacts are the only thing at the end of the day that a lot of people of the country have that connects them to their past and how important it is to protect them. And there's a scene I really love where Susenyos teaches Kidan the value of history through artifacts, how it's important to always preserve them. And eventually that leads to a bigger plot point, but it was just a chance to include a piece of my love for history in that way. And I think in book 2 and 3 we'll also see us delve more about what it means for Kidan to be Ethiopian and connect to her heritage because she's quite disconnected in the very beginning of it.
Yes, she is. And that's a lovely journey that she goes on in this book in many
Hmm.
ways. And I think, I think there is a small commentary that you've made in relation to the relationship between, colonized places and the colonizer and the
Hmm.
retention of artifacts. Would you like to comment on that a little bit more?
Oh, yeah. I think especially because a lot of the results from colonization is that a lot of people that have been colonized have lost their artifacts or that they've lost pieces of their history. And to this day, I think there's so many pieces of Ethiopian artifacts in British museums, and this is, from the 19th century, they've been taken and there's negotiations where we're trying to get it back, but, the British Museum won't give it back. And we've also had a lot of artifacts that have been returned to us. And I remember recently there's just this ceremony whenever an artifact is returned to us, we hold it so dearly. There's like everyone goes out on the street and celebrates it because it really means a lot to us to have that back. So I think that's what I wanted really to comment on, how important it was for, these colonized countries to really have what belongs to them returned to them in a way. So I'm really passionate about that, and I like that Senios does that. He does that. He just goes and takes back whatever he thinks it belongs to his country because as he should.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, just a bit earlier, we were talking about that sort of tension between Sesenyos and Kidan and, what makes people, want to turn the page in this book. But I kind of want to say that, there's no mistaking in this book that this is a novel about, trying to, create a peaceful coexistence between humans and vampires and the rules that need to be in place for that to happen. But the tension between Kidan and the vampire that she must live with, Sesenyos, to inherit the House of Adani is off the charts. And he does everything he can really to drive her away. But her determination to stay matches his. And I think that's what makes this so alluring about them as a couple, if I can call them that. Now, was
Hmm.
that something that you were conscious of while writing? That sort of like they matched each other in terms of determination?
Hmm. Hmm. For sure. That's where all the tension comes from, like you said. The idea that he wants to get rid of her as much as she hates him, but not, she can't kill him because he's powerful, and he can't kill her because the laws of Yuxley restrain him. Because I needed a reason for why this vampire that's so powerful could not just, get rid of her if he wanted to. I really loved restraining Sesenios with the world of Yuxley and making Kidan as free as possible so they can match on some level. And that's where they clash. And the tension of that is, who's going to leave this house? Are they going to leave it alive? Is one of them going to be hurt or injured? And they play tricks on each other, trying to just manipulate one another in order to own this house. I think it's just the most fun I've had writing that scene where they go back and forth with each other, trying to do pranks, but very deadly pranks, not just kiddie pranks.
Indeed, deadly is the word. It's
Yeah,
frightening.
there's no mercy. I do love it. I just felt like, this. I feel like anything could happen and it could be like justified for them for some reason because they're so, just impulsive and very fiery.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we talked a little bit about your Ethiopian heritage and how you've infused that in this novel and the Ethiopian artifacts. Was there any other research that you did in order to bring this story alive on the page?
I think the most research I did was just asking my parents about, because a lot of Ethiopian stories are taught or told through oral storytelling. We don't really document a lot of things. So, folk tales are passed down from grandfather to father, father to son, sort of thing. So I would just always ask my parents, what is interesting folk tales we have about, creatures? And we didn't have anything that was specifically vampires, but we had these interesting creatures, a were hyena, where apparently a hyena can turn to a man and stalk you and try to kill you and stuff. And I was like, okay, that's so interesting. And funnily enough, we have like about 80 or so tribes within Ethiopia. So, that's a lot of content and story that just, and each has its own language and specific culture as well. It's not just one. And I always think a lot of the Western world think Africa is just one country with one story, whereas even Ethiopia has 80 different subgroups within it. So I was just very overwhelmed by the amount of story we have. So I wanted to take it piece by piece and sort of infuse vampire with how I would imagine it if it originated from, the highlands of Ethiopia. So I would use pieces of impala horn in the storytelling of vampires, which was instead of a snake killing a vampire, it would be an impala. Impala is an animal, so an antelope horn. And impala is very important to the highlands in Ethiopia because it's a very majestic creature. We see that as. So I was just infusing pieces of it without getting too overwhelmed because it's very easy for you to get lost in the vastness of your own tales. So I just took pieces of that and I used a lot of lion symbolism in the story because lions represent power and might in Ethiopia, and as well as Ethiopian emperors would always have lions flying around in their courts. And I was like, that's such an interesting piece of history. I'm gonna try to weave that in. So just pieces of discovery that was not too overwhelming, but just that served the story. That's, I think, how I would always go back and refer to my culture if I need to.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's what makes this book so unique and so rich. It's all of those little touchstones, those little details that you've added
Little
that make
details,
it,
yes.
yeah, that make it so wonderful. Okay, so you mentioned that you are planning books 2 and 3 or have written books 2 and 3. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
They're not written. They're sort of planned. So I'm deep into book 2 right now. Hopefully nearing the end stages. It's been quite interesting because this is my first time writing a series. I've always done only, just the first book and moved on when they got rejected by agents. But this is the first time I'm actively continuing Kidan's story, and I'm learning a lot about how much more patience you would need with yourself specifically. I feel like because sometimes with second books you sort of forget how to tell a story. That's what happens. That's what all the authors call it. And I had to sort of relearn and rediscover, my joy for writing in a way with this book, and because it is the world gets quite smaller with each book because you have to follow the specific paths and foreshadowing you've laid out. It's not just an open book with the first book. So I'm learning a lot about that and how to, follow things through so it's satisfying for the reader and they get to the end and they're like, oh, this is a very good trilogy. So learning a lot, but it's coming along well now because I've been working on it for like a year now.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be wonderful when you're finished with it, Tigist. And
Thank
so
you.
Immortal Dark is available in the US and in the UK as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So it was originally, I think, was the US team that bought the book, and it was the UK and the Australian team that got attached to it. So my main publisher is actually in the US, and they've been wonderful. They've been so understanding. They've done a very stunning first edition with sprayed edges, which I'm very happy with. So it's been going really great. But yeah, it's found. You can find it in UK and the US as well. Yes.
That's wonderful because I have some global listeners, so I'm sure those global listeners will be very interested to know that they can pick up their copy
Yay.
from the UK and in the US. And that sprayed edge version, oh my gosh, that is divine.
It looks really beautiful. I'm just always looking at it just for inspiration to keep going.
That's very good inspiration indeed. You mentioned that you had written previous books that have been rejected. And so I
Mhm.
wondered, for the benefit of other writers who are listening into this podcast, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your journey to publication.
So I've written about 3 books before Immortal Dark. The first one I never queried or I never sent it out to agents, but the last 2 I did, and they were both rejected. So being a writer is quite a journey, isn't it? It's quite difficult. So anyone that's out there, my best advice is going to be a cliche, and I'm sorry, forgive me for this, but you just have to be so stubborn in your pursuit of this career because it will do everything to sort of break you down and make you doubt your skills as a writer. It's just part of it. And I'm happy to tell you, or sad to tell you, that that never goes away even after you're published. So, so that's something you have to look forward to. It's just you have to make peace with it.
Yes.
It's your companion, it's your friend, it is doubt and fear. And you always go with that. And I thought, after I published my first book, it would be, all work out. It will be like, I know how to tell stories now. It'll be fun. But you're always discovering new ways to tell a story. And with that comes doubt of, is it going to work? And I think that's what I've been feeling since I began this journey, since I was like 18, 17. And I think sort of your love for writing has to be greater than your fear of the rejection. I think that's my main advice. And if you always cling to that, somewhere down the road, you will make it, trust me, and you will be content with this creative living you're attempting, which I applaud you for. It's a very difficult road, but please join us. It's very fun in the end.
Oh, I love that. That is wonderful. Wonderful tip there indeed. So, are you still teaching?
Good question. So when I'm on like heavy deadlines, I'm a casual teacher, so I just pop in whenever I'm needed. But I've been taking breaks whenever I'm too overwhelmed with the writing. So I go in whenever I can, but it's been quite challenging to balance those two now because the deadlines are quite interesting. That's another tip for writers out there. Right now, you are so free, you don't have deadlines.
Yeah.
Please enjoy this moment because once you are published and you are under contract, you are given a certain date to meet, and creative inspiration better be there by that date. But no pressure. It's fun.
Ah. Oh, well, that's very handy that you're able to dip in and out of the teaching as
Yes,
required.
yes. It quite refreshes my brain. So whenever I send off a round of edits to my editor, I have a bit of time where I could just, go in and teach for a couple of days and be like, oh wow, this is the other world. This other reality exists. And then, it refocuses me.
I love that. And so, do any of your students know that you've written this fantastic book?
No, because specifically they're primary school teachers,
Ah,
students. So
okay.
I hope they don't know. That's my hope. But you know what it is with the kids these days? If they find out your last name, they will just search you up. So my
Yeah.
goal is to just let them not know my last name, and I go by like they call me Miss G. So that's all they know. They don't know anything else. So I feel like as long as I do that, they won't find out I'm an author. But because they're not high school kids. If it was high school, it would be different. They're still
Yeah.
little young kids. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit of a worry, when you think primary school kids might be reading books like this. Although I do have to say, when my oldest son was in primary school, a lot of his contemporaries were reading Twilight, and
Wow. See, this
I
is what I mean.
refused. I
Yeah. And I've
refused to
seen
let him read it.
and I've seen some students read really adult books, and I was like, what do you mean you're reading that now? And especially the girls, they quite pick up books that are quite for, I don't know why they do that, but yeah, sometimes I'm like, you should not be reading that book. That's not for you at this age.
I know it is a little bit of a scary world sometimes, but yes, okay, kids is listening to this podcast. Wait until you're in high school to be reading this
Yes,
book.
yes. I feel like when you're 15, 16, that's okay. You got it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so apart from a compulsive experience for readers of this book, is there a takeaway message that you'd like readers to take from it?
I didn't really write the book with a message, sort of. I think if there was any sort of message, it would be just, I want you to read more diversely. Maybe that's my
Mhm.
message. I
Yeah.
want you to be open to exploring more diverse fantasy and other, not Western influenced fantasy, but other types of fantasies, because there's a lot of books you're sort of denying yourself when you limit yourself to one specific type of story. So I think my goal is to help Black readers feel seen in this space, because I just never had that for myself. A step beyond that maybe is just for it to be so normal to pick up any sort of fantasy
Yeah.
and the lead to be a person of color. I just want that to be the big thing that everyone's reading about at the center of it. I would love it if that was a person of color instead of, just a white person that we always see. I think that's what
Yeah.
I want to do.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I love it. Tigist, I absolutely loved reading Immortal Dark. It's a phenomenal slay of a book. I
Oh,
wish
thank
you
you. I
I
love
wish you
that.
every success and cannot wait for books 2 and 3. Thank you for joining me on Talking
Oh,
Aussie Books today.
thank you so much. You are a very good host. This has been so great. Thank you. And good luck with your writing, and good luck with all writers out there. You got it.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.